When considering purchasing a short-term rental investment in the Smoky Mountains, it can be very tempting to want to take over the previous owner's future bookings. Today, we're going to talk about 3 reasons why that might not always be in your best interest when you're buying a new property for short-term rental. Let's get started. Hey guys, today we're going to talk about why you don't necessarily need to take over the existing and future bookings of a property that you're purchasing in this market. In this market, there are tons of short-term rentals. We know this. We've discussed this a million times. That's the reason this is a really great place to invest in short-term rentals, because short-term rentals have been around here for decades. The regulations are very favorable and the tourism numbers are outstanding. A lot of times when you go to purchase a property, that property will have previously been a short-term rental managed with the previous owner or a property management company. Oftentimes, the previous owners will try to use future bookings as a negotiation tool, and you really don't have to engage in that, and here's why. I know we're talking about short-term rentals, but I'm gonna use my long-term rentals as an example. When I buy a long-term rental, I do not want a tenant that I'm inheriting from the previous owner. The only evictions I've ever had to do have been on inherited tenants. I want an empty property where I can screen my own tenants and get them in there, and I've never had to evict a tenant that I've personally screened. It's kind of the same thing with short-term rentals, except the good news is you don't actually have to worry about evictions. You can just say, no, I don't want the future bookings. Your question might be now, why don't I want the future bookings? Don't I want all that money? And I'm about to explain why you don't necessarily want the future bookings. There are several reasons why you don't want the future bookings. I just explained that with my long-term rentals, usually my screening practices don't line up with the previous owner's screening practices. And that's the same thing with short-term rentals. A lot of times the previous manager isn't managing his property or her property the way that you're going to. So a lot of times your future guests that you're taking over from a previous manager might be subpar. These might have been guests that you would not have allowed yourself. So you could be asking for a headache by taking these over. Number 2, even if they are good guests, especially if they're on Airbnb and VRBO, there's no way for those companies to just transfer guests over to your new platform or over to your new listing. So those guests are gonna come in pre-annoyed with you, because the only way to really transfer future bookings on these platforms is for the previous seller to cancel his bookings, and as he cancels them, send a link to your new listing with booking information. So the guests are already going to be annoyed because they've had to rebook, they've had to book twice with 2 different people, and that might make them more sensitive to things about your property that they wouldn't normally be sensitive to. It might make them a little more complainy, and it can definitely affect your reviews at that point. Another reason why it's not always a good idea to engage in the future bookings of a previous owner is that a lot of times that owner will try to leverage those bookings in the negotiation process of the real estate sale. For example, they might ask for more money than what the property is worth because of the future bookings. This isn't going to work because this is not a commercial property. A property that grosses $100,000 is worth the same as the same property that grosses $10,000. So it still has to appraise based on the residential sold comps. So just because there's $20,000 in bookings on the books does not make this property worth any more than the one next door that has 0 that's never been a rental. Another tactic that sellers might use is they might say, here, you can have my future bookings, but I need a 10% finder's fee, or I need a 20% finder's fee. Never engage in this. This is very messy, gets very messy at closing. Nobody ends up happy. The guests aren't happy, you're not happy. The seller might be happy, but that's about it. That doesn't benefit you at all. So try to stay away from engaging in that type of negotiation. Just say, I'm not interested in the future bookings, cancel them, we'll close on the property and start fresh. That's the great thing about this market, and I know it sounds easy for me to say if you're a newbie, you are going to get booked. If you have a nice property and you have good pictures, pro photography is very important, and then you're gonna get booked. You don't need another owner's future bookings. So again, to recap, why you don't need future bookings. You don't need to open up a conversation with the seller about finder's fees and them receiving a percentage of the bookings. It's best to just cut that off at the get-go. B, it doesn't make the property worth any more. C, there's a really good chance you don't want that previous manager's renters anyway, because they might have been renters that you would not have allowed to rent your property. And then lastly, if you do take those on, those guys are going to be annoyed that they had to rebook, that they have a new owner to deal with, and new rules, and potentially a different price or house rules. So all of this together, lots of reasons why you don't necessarily, it's not necessarily in your best interest to take on future bookings, even though it might sound great at the beginning. We are agents in this market, so if you guys are interested in buying a rental property, short-term rental in this market, that is all we do all day, every day, is work with investors on acquiring short-term rentals, and we negotiate all of this stuff for you, so you don't have to get bogged down